Thank you. You did the presentation, so I'll just do a benediction. Well, first off, I have to apologize. This is not the voice of a storyteller. Well, this is the voice of a storyteller with a cold. So I'm a little gravelly, a little hoarse tonight, so do bear with me as we talk. And a couple of other, well, not really apologies, but to give you a little bit of a context. Doniphan is new to me. I was asked about a year ago to tell some patriotic stories for a local organization. And I was kind of looking through my stories, and none of them really fit the category that I thought would be patriotic. Well, yes, there were themes that I thought would work. And I just remembered hearing about Alexander William Doniphan, particularly in a bit different order than you presented, him being the Mexican War hero, and knowing there was a community in Missouri named after him. And we have often run across his name when teaching the geography of Missouri, particularly because of this march. Well, I began to look at his life and discover very interesting features about him, a very colorful and important character in Missouri. So began to tell a few little excerpts of his stories. I have been doing mostly in my storytelling career stories out of the Ozarks. Also thematic stories according to the season. I just came off of doing a lot of October Halloween stories and was here at Blair Oaks Middle School just on Halloween Day. And part of my voice, I think, is that I told to about 3,000 kids and adults in about 15 different settings over the past 2 weeks, so we're a little thin. So tonight is not storytelling, not in the sense that I normally do it. So I'm really more just wanting to talk to you about this person that I discovered. Now, some of you may indeed be experts on Doniphan. I was in Kansas City last week at the Kansas City Storytelling Celebration and noticed as I was driving down a highway outside of Liberty that it was the Alexander Doniphan Memorial Highway. I had no idea. And there I was. I had lunch with a person during that week who belongs to the Alexander Doniphan Society. I had no idea. A group of folks in the Independence and Liberty area who every year select out someone for an Alexander Doniphan Award. Well, he said to me, yeah, but you're from mid-Missouri, so you probably don't know much about Doniphan. And so that's a part of my introduction. I don't. But I do want to share with you some of the very interesting aspects of his life, the places that he served, the people that he met and worked with, and particularly, I think, his relevance for our time. And I'll come to that in a little bit. There we are. Well, typically, this is the kind of portrait and image that we often see of Doniphan. He is the hero, back from the war with Mexico. And there were books and pamphlets and stories, editorials that put him in this context as the dashing young hero in his 30s, able to command troops and to have this successful march into Mexico. Now, you'll see on this map that his military tour did start in Fort Leavenworth and was a part of Kearny's attempt to take Mexico. Eventually to Santa Fe, Kearny will go off to fight in California. And Doniphan and Sterling Price and others from Missouri eventually head down and eventually to Chihuahua and out and then back by steamship to Missouri. A trip of something in the neighborhood of 4,500 miles. So it was considered at that time one of the longest, and some would have said the longest, continuous march. When you count the original volunteers that came out of Clay County and went with Doniphan on this entire adventure over really just about a year's time. So a remarkable journey in fighting numbers of battles. Now, at the same time, There was another group that was a part of the original group of folks that left Fort Leavenworth that went to California with Kearney, and that included about 500 Mormon volunteers. I'll say a bit more about them later. They went on to California and secured California. It became a part of the United States, and many of them went all the way back to Missouri. Now, when they calculate their miles, they say, I think we went about 1,000 miles further than Doniphan. So you get a little bit of competition as to who had the greatest march. But for most folks, in their imaging the status and character of Doniphan, he was the hero. From Fort Leavenworth all the way back to Liberty, almost a complete circle. Well, when he was returning after the Battle of Sacramento, the poet William Cullen Bryant compared him to Xenophon, the Greek hero who took his troops all the way to Persia. Now that was a part of what caught my attention when I learned about Alexander Doniphan. When I was preparing for going to graduate seminary in religious studies, I thought in undergraduate it would be important for me to take Greek, since of course I would read the New Testament in the original Koine Greek. So I thought, somewhat naively, as a sophomore in college, I better start taking Greek, and declared it as my language. 13 hours of Greek, 13 hours of C later, I began to wonder if this was going to work out. Then I took a course on the Peloponnesian Wars by Xenophon, and we translated it. Got a bit better. I thought I could follow the story better than just learning to speak Greek. And finally, the last semester, we translated the book of John and the book of Acts, and then I was at home. So just wanted to tell you I did survive Greek. But when I saw Xenophon, I go, oh yeah, I know that person. And again, putting Alexander Doniphan in the same category as a great Greek military conqueror leader was quite something. And again, books, documents, pamphlets, posters, all produced to hail that. Well, I wanted to tell you that I'm not going to do this chronologically. Now that would make sense, but I mostly work in the realm of non-rational communication. And someone else does. So I want to talk about these two big episodes in his life, and then go back and fill in some chronology. So I want to talk about the Mexican War first, because that was my entry point in the life of Doniphan. He was a Whig, and they were, of course, a dominant political party in the first half of the 19th century. They wound up being in a minority position by the time you get to the 1850s, and eventually disappeared in the 1860s. Well, he was committed as a Whig, and the Whigs, as you know, had control of the presidency, and at times were a significant political party in Congress. They were a party that eventually, for Missouri, established themselves as anti-Jacksonian Democrats. They were the rational, the thoughtful, the concerned for the whole party at that time. They were very much for small business, and that was particularly important in Missouri. They were interested in welfare or common good. They were interested in very strict obedience to the law. So hard to imagine that we in Missouri could look back and say Jacksonian Democrats were the liberals. But in terms of interpretation of law, the Whigs established that as rational and thoughtful. And it pretty much was the Whigs who were interested in westward expansion. And so that captured the imagination of a lot of folks who came out of Kentucky and Tennessee into Missouri and began to look further west. And so he winds up being in that same position of saying, we need to expand west. That's a part of our duty, in one sense, to bring democracy to the rest of the continent, and a part of our legacy and momentum as we look back in the past. Another aspect that would have been common at the time was slavery. The Whigs, for the most part, were pro-slavery. Now, as you know, in Missouri, the Democrats divided into pro and anti-slavery. But the Whigs were pretty consistently advocates of slavery. We can look back and now apply our own moral judgment and perhaps have some criticisms about that. But for their time and their place, it was an understanding of property and property rights. And for business expansion, he assumed that position. So the Mexican War for the Whigs, including Zachary Taylor, was a matter of bringing to Mexico democracy, law and order, and a part of westward expansion. The Whigs understood that keeping Texas in the Union and not becoming an independent country, and perhaps having alliances with somebody like Great Britain, it was important to assert the presence of the United States into Mexico. Now, you know from Missouri history that we had trade relationships initially with Spain and then with Mexico. And as Missouri was forming as a state, the Santa Fe Trail was formed, and that was very important. So for the Whigs, it was also securing our trade with the Mexicans. So Doniphan was in a position to say, sure, this is a logical outflow of our political position. Here's just a brief map of the Santa Fe Trail. So for them to travel down the Santa Fe Trail and secure those parts of northern Mexico was a logical extension of their beliefs. So they left Fort Leavenworth. There was a number of units pulled together. Initially, those numbers probably were something in the neighborhood of 3,000 or so, but that included Kearny and his dragoons that went on to California. It included other units that joined them, and they included the 500 or so Mormons. So by the time they turned south out of Santa Fe, we were looking at smaller numbers. At any given time, they probably were dealing with 700 to 800 folks in any one unit that Doniphan would have commanded. Well, I'm sorry, back up. They all rendezvoused at Fort Bent. Now, I don't know if some of you have been to the site of Fort Bent or know something about Fort Bent, but that was the happening place. Fort Bent was built by the Bent brothers and others, and built as a kind of a luxury site for all trappers and traders and connections of all kinds to Mexico. It was the largest, most impressive forts. It had several stories for storage. It had indoor bath facilities. It had room for wagons to pull in and be repaired. It was just the center of all commerce in all directions. So it was the rendezvous point for many of the Western explorers and adventurers. I've spent a good deal of time looking at the life of Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. Perhaps you know him. He was the child of Sacagawea and Toussaint Charbonneau. He was the infant pictured often in our remembrances of Sacagawea. Well, he lived to be 60 years old and spent a lot of his older adult life on the westward trails. He probably was at the Fort Bent at about the same time that Kearny, Doniphan, Sterling Price had all come through. But you would have met Kit Carson there. You would have met other Missouri leaders and heroes. Governors and their sons would also take adventures out further west. And Fort Bent was the place. So this was the initial rendezvous spot to get organized for the continuing march into Mexico. Well, as I said, at about the same time, some things were happening with the Mormons. And you know a bit about the Mormon history. When the Mormons settled in the eastern part of the state of Missouri, there was initially some difficulty. And they, as you know, within a decade had been forced out into Illinois. And it was at that point, after Joseph Smith was killed, that Brigham Young took leadership and decided they would be headed out west to Utah. Well, as Brigham Young was establishing his outposts in Utah and building up his new realm of Deseret, the United States government was a bit concerned. The Mormons were well organized. They were good at engineering wagons and weapons. They were so productive and so tightly organized that there was some thought in Washington at that time, well, what if the Mormons should decide to join the Mexicans? Or what if the Mormons and the Native Americans and the Mexicans would form a coalition? This would not bode well for Western expansion of those in the eastern part of the United States. So negotiations happened with Brigham Young, and Young was wanting some guarantees of safety for his Mormons that were making the trek. And he said, if you will guarantee us safety, I will supply troops for you to fight in the Mexican War. And so the Mormon battalion was formed, and they again joined along with Doniphan and others to head southwest and eventually all the way to California. This was a part of the mass exodus of Mormons into the West, and will again figure prominently in the life of Doniphan in his later years. I want to go back just a bit earlier. Now, we recognize him as the hero of the Mexican War, but things are happening. Okay, you got to respond. Here's another picture of the Mormon Battalion, 1846-47. They made their adventure through the South, eventually forming what's called the Gila Trail, and eventually became the Gadsden Purchase, eventually became the Santa Fe Rail Line. So they headed out west. Doniphan and his troops then moved south out of eventually Santa Fe and headed to a number of battles on their way to the center of Mexico. Here, once Kearny and his troops had taken Santa Fe, and pretty much without a battle, there was not enough organized resistance that Kearny was able to step in and organize. And here he gave Doniphan one of the most important responsibilities that he had had in his life at that time. In August of 1846, Kearny announced to the new, to the folks of Santa Fe that they were going to be in a new relationship. You are the United States of America, Kearny said to those inhabitants of Santa Fe. He was organizing to go to California, so he turned to Alexander Doniphan and said, create some laws. To bring this territory into the United States, they need to be organized. Doniphan, being an attorney, took the position, and in a matter of approximately a month, wrote the laws for the new territory of New Mexico. Excuse me. He decided there would be 3 branches of government. So he created executive and legislative and judicial. It is often known as Kearny's Code, but you know the truth. It was Alexander Doniphan who constructed that. It was therefore used as a model for other Western territories in their organizing to become a part of the United States. Kearny goes to California then and leaves Doniphan in charge of New Mexico. Well, there was one little problem that they hadn't dealt with significantly, and that was the Navajos. Primarily, they were dealing with Mexicans and descendants of the Spanish people. So Kearny, in a sense, leaves Doniphan in charge of this newly organized territory and take care of those Navajos. In a number of smaller skirmishes and battles, Doniphan tries to subdue the Navajos with his Missouri volunteers. Well, they get a few of the key leaders of the Navajo finally in a position to sit down and sign a document. Well, the difficulty, and often that was the case with Western development, those particular Navajo leaders weren't necessarily recognized as the leaders of those people or those people or those people. So the 4 or 5 who finally agreed on it did not represent the whole of the Navajos. No sooner than the ink was dry on the paper than they were back to the skirmishes and so on. It is one of those perhaps sad commentaries of Doniphan's life that he was not able to successfully bring the Navajo people into a harmonious relationship. Nothing was resolved. But his charge was to go south toward El Paso So basically leaves it for Sterling Price and others to take care of the Navajo. And that problem would continue, as you know, clear into the end of the 19th century. So unresolved issue with the Navajo and also with the Apache. Down the Camino Real, Doniphan goes with his troops headed for Mexico. The two most significant battles were first the Battle of El Bracito. And Doniphan there began to show himself as successful as to being able to organize these crude Missouri volunteers into fighting units. They were not the well-trained, disciplined dragoons, the cavalry of Kearny, but he demonstrated that they could do the job and was successful in enabling those two battles, El Bracito and Sacramento, which was just outside of Chihuahua, to be won, and therefore begins to get the reputation back in Missouri of heroic proportions. Well, he could just take those Missouri boys and go down there and show against greater numbers, even against disciplined Mexican troops, that Missouri boys could handle this situation. Yes, Doniphan understood organization, he understood military strategies, but he was particularly charismatic in getting his folks to work with him, which we will notice in other aspects of his life as well. Once arriving in Chihuahua, and eventually with Sterling Price arriving, they successfully take the major center of Chihuahua, and then for a few months occupy it. The primary agenda was to keep commerce flowing. All the traders from Missouri coming down the Santa Fe Trail wanting to work with it. So traders were brought all the way down to Chihuahua. So Chihuahua winds up being established as an important U.S. trading post deep within Mexico. And the occupation begins to get easier and easier, and relationships improve to the point that Doniphan could be relieved of his duty and allowed to go back to Missouri. But the Battle of Sacramento, again portrayed by artists at the time of being such a heroic adventure. El Bracito not so much, but particularly Sacramento, to the point that it began to be characterized as the battle that defeated the Mexicans. That would have been the point at which most folks would have perceived the Mexican to be argued to be the strongest. So books, pamphlets, and so on, hailing Alexander Doniphan as the hero, the conquering hero. And returning home, coming back to St. Louis. Sorry, not getting this clicker to respond. There we go. I want to back up, though, and say that Doniphan, the Mexican war hero, already had established himself with leadership qualities. And that's the events that took place about 10 years earlier. I mentioned a little bit ago that in Missouri the Mormon Wars had been engaged. The Mormons were originally in Jackson County and negotiated to be a little further north in Clay County, and trouble seemed to happen. Some of the Mormon leaders, including Joseph Smith, then employed some attorneys to help them negotiate with the state of Missouri. And they hired a couple of young lawyers, one, Alexander Doniphan, and his colleague, David Rice Atchison. And so they worked on behalf of the Mormons and established a part of Ray County to be established as Caldwell and Davies County for a new home for the Mormons. And so they were able to move north. So he was showing his ability to moderate in difficult situations. He had noted at various times in his life that he didn't particularly believe the theology nor the practices of the Mormon, but on the basis of law, they were entitled to have property rights and entitled to have a secure future. That was not the case with other governmental leadership in Missouri. Lilburn Boggs was elected in 1836 on a platform of anti-Mormonism. And so he had come in, and by 1838, when fighting and skirmishes had become so prevalent, local militias were called to fight the Mormons. This is the statement that Boggs released in 1838. The Mormons must be treated as enemies, must be exterminated or driven from the state, if necessary, for the public good. Their outrages are beyond all description. October 27, 1838. That essentially gave permission, or what some would have termed at that time period, the shoot to kill order on Mormons. The militia was called up to deal with kind of corralling them and catching them. And so Doniphan was called up as a part of the local militia. He only served for a period of 11 days. But in those 11 days, he was face to face with Mormon militia and eventually captured Joseph Smith, his brother Hiram, a total of 5 of the Mormon leadership. Now, he was working at that time under the leadership of another, sorry, there we go. He was operating under the leadership of other military authorities, but those authorities turned over the management of Joseph Smith to Doniphan. On the night of November 1st, I'm wondering if this was a coincidence or not, All Saints Day, a court-martial was held, a tribunal for Joseph Smith and his colleagues. At 11 o'clock at night, the tribunal was still going. The decision was made to execute them. At that point, Doniphan said he would not participate in the execution. He did not believe this was appropriate legal behavior. Now, we know from looking at the documents in the past that he had already begun to get a sense of whether or not he could do this. He would be in disagreement with his commanding officers, but he had the support of his troops. And he made this statement: "It is cold-blooded murder. I will not obey your order, and if you execute these men, I will hold you responsible before an earthly tribunal, so help me God." They did not execute Joseph Smith, nor Hiram, the other men. They instead bound them over to jail in Liberty, and were set to go with proceedings against them the following year, not until after the first of the year. In the meantime, Doniphan only served 11 days in the militia, went back to his legal practices, and then began to work to try to negotiate what would happen to Joseph Smith and others. Initially, it looked like it would be a losing case, but Doniphan was always one to keep winning these cases. He was a defense attorney for all his life, and they often said about Doniphan, he always won his cases on his rhetoric and his faithfulness to the law. And when you combine those qualities of reasonable, persuasive language and knowing the law and faithfulness to the law, he would win these cases. And so he was getting them a change of venue for them. Initially, they moved them out of Liberty, and eventually had put them on a wagon and headed for Columbia, for Boone County. However, that night, just outside of Boone County, the deputy jailers who were in charge got drunk, and all of the Mormons escaped. And they escaped to Illinois. And there began the founding of Nauvoo, and for the next decade or so, built their new center in Illinois. Now, the question that haunted lots of people at the time was, who got the deputies drunk? There is some suggestion when you start looking at the comments and records at the time that Governor Boggs might have been involved. No one has been able to prove that per se, but the suggestion was that having Joseph Smith alive was too much of an embarrassment. So he may have arranged and paid off somebody and so on, and the escape was arranged so that they were basically out of Missouri, and as we would sometimes say, not my problem anymore. But for Doniphan, that begins to be reputation. Now, I went first to the Mexican War because he was known as the hero. I backed up 10 years and went to this early episode. So now we have 2 wars, 2 situations about 10 years apart, and it began to build Doniphan as such a charismatic and respectable character. But there were other things that led to this possibility from going from lawyer to public figure. He was from Kentucky, born 1808, attended Augusta College, and his two skills, rhetoric and charisma, seemed to be there. He was licensed to practice in Kentucky and Ohio, but within a year had moved out to the frontier in Missouri. He was 6'4", full head of reddish hair, piercing hazel eyes. His stature, his demeanor, when he argued in court, people were mesmerized. You read his speeches, his documents, they are so well crafted. He makes his argument, but again, it's this combination of presence and articulate. He was drawn to the frontier in 1827, and from then on made his home in Missouri. As we heard about saving the life of Joseph Smith, he went on to defend additional Mormon rights. One of the Mormon leaders, a man by the name of Orrin Rockwell, made an assassination attempt on Lilburn Boggs a little bit later in retribution, and Doniphan defended Rockwell in that trial. So you can see where the Mormons were saying, he's our guy, but not being a Mormon, faithful to the law. He was also very interested in the Platte Purchase. And as you know, up until the 1830s, that little extreme northwestern corner of what's Missouri now was not Missouri. And this had been territory for Native Americans that had been pushed west. And he, as a part of that westward expansion understanding, was one of the advocates to gain it. And so he was a part of the negotiation, a part of the drafting, and a part of the creation. So we can, in one sense, give Doniphan credit for making that corner of Missouri, and not, heaven forbid, Kansas. He continued to establish his reputation as a defense lawyer with his excellent oration skills, but a few other things. Now, I know, in talking with some of the folks at Independence, that the Mormons would rather not mention one little habit he had, and that's gambling. But he admitted that himself. He was often involved in card games. And he even admitted himself he would win cases with words, whether or not the person was guilty or innocent. In his physical stature, as I said earlier, he began to invest his profits in business enterprises, railroads, real estate, but experienced a tragic event with the death of both of his sons over about a 10-year period. His first son accidentally committed suicide. I mean, he was not intending to it. He had a stomach upset, and he thought he was taking some Epsom salts, and instead had taken a mercury compound and died. And within just about 10 years, his second son, Alexander William Doniphan Jr., drowned in what is now West Virginia. He was attending Bethany College in the Christian church, and some of his friends were swimming across the Buffalo Creek in a time of high water, and he drowned. So in a short period of time, in this period, he suffered that tragedy. In addition, his wife had a stroke. And so he was caught in the midst of a family situation in the 1850s, and just sort of immersed himself in his work. Now, after the Mexican War, he went right back into that same business. Made his home in Liberty, Missouri. As was mentioned earlier, he was one of the founders of William Jewell College. And also, when I was studying the life of Alexander Campbell, one of the founders of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, Campbell had become friends with Doniphan. In 1852, Campbell had made a trip all across Missouri, from St. Louis to Hannibal, all the way out to St. Joseph, down to Liberty, back across, even spoke in the state capitol in Jefferson City. Well, Campbell, when he was in Liberty, met with his old friend Doniphan. And there Doniphan contributed to money to help build and support Bethany College, which still exists today in Bethany, West Virginia. So very much interested in higher education. He also became the first superintendent of schools for Ray County. So very much interested in other folks having education. He served the Missouri legislature 3 different times, 1836, 1840, 1854. Though he was a member of the Christian church, he had also supported work in the Baptist church, and as we've already mentioned, in terms of Mormon. But the issue that got so much emotional connection for him was the issue of slavery. He was witnessing his own Missouri being torn up by slavery. He was pro-slavery and pro-union. Again, there were people in Missouri that assumed that position, but he was a strong advocate. Basically, he says, what the U.S. Congress decides is the law. And if they say, and again with the 1850 Compromise and so on, that we will abide by that law. But he thought that slavery was a right to be defended, but not a reason to disintegrate the Union. He was a colleague with Atchison, but as you know, David Rice Atchison was a little more expressive in his support of slavery. Both Doniphan and Atchison were interested in Kansas becoming a slave state. We do not have evidence that Doniphan ever went on any kind of violent episodes in Kansas. We know he was in Kansas, but no evidence that he had joined Atchison, for example, in the first burning of Lawrence, Kansas. Not Quantrill, but the David Rice Atchison burning of Lawrence, Kansas. But he was supportive of allowing Missourians to go into Kansas and to vote, but at the same time opposed secession in Missouri. The other difficult thing for him there was watching his own favorite political party disintegrate before his eyes. The Whigs had had candidates for president, candidate for senate, and one by one, particularly in Missouri, they were just not able to make headway. As we mentioned earlier, he was often suggested as a Senate candidate, as a congressional candidate, as governor, and at every point he declined, again thinking that his own presence would be divisive and not good for the Union. But he had no compulsion for seeking higher office, and therefore put himself at a bit of disadvantage in trying to deal with some of the issues of slavery. He spent the late 1850s and into the early 1860s doing lots of pro-union speeches. He was not in favor of Lincoln. He had supported Bell in the presidential election. And interesting, in that same period, he received offers from both the Confederacy and the Union Army to be an officer. And he said no to both of them on the grounds it's divisive, I believe in the Union. He tried to find as many opportunities for compromise as he could, which led him then to be accepted as a candidate to the Peace Conference in February of 1861. This meeting was quote-unquote secret, except everybody knew it was happening. But they tried to get delegates from all of the states, including Confederate states, to come and resolve the issues that were separating the United States. And so the Peace Conference was there. Doniphan went initially with great enthusiasm that we could stop the war. And in the next days, as that convention went on, it just disintegrated into every party arguing with every party. Doniphan became increasingly frustrated and depressed that it was going nowhere. But he met Lincoln. And when he met Abraham Lincoln, this is what Lincoln said. Doniphan, and this is Colonel Doniphan, who made the wild march against the Navajos and the Mexicans. You are the only man I ever met who in appearance came up to my previous expectations. How many other people do you remember Abraham Lincoln looking up to? Now, you could say probably they weren't both tall enough to look eye to eye, but to respect Doniphan's position, knowing that Doniphan had worked against Lincoln, but knowing that Doniphan had also worked so hard to try to make a speech. Doniphan said after the peace conference, I am a Union man. I go for the whole Union. But after returning from the failed peace conference, he returns to Missouri, which is thoroughly involved in the in the wars. He did not agree with Lincoln's decision on emancipation. He became pretty fervently anti-Republican. He was for the three branches of government, but here was the point: with his own Whig party disintegrating, he becomes a Democrat, but often what we call bourbon Democrats, the sort of wealthier, business-oriented, pro-slavery Democrats. So not the kind of what we might suspect as the Deep South Democrats. He did not like the war, particularly as the war was so unraveling his beloved Western Missouri. He moved back to St. Louis and spent the rest of the Civil War in St. Louis and practicing law as well there. He later then returns, not back to Liberty, but to Richmond, and there continues to practice law until about 1870. After his wife died, he began to be a bit more reclusive, but getting up in years. He had two significant trips that he made. One was to the west, to see where his beliefs in westward expansion would take him. And when they heard in Salt Lake City that he was going to be in the neighborhood, he was ushered into Salt Lake City and given tremendous honors, and hailed then as the hero who saved the prophet. And to this day, and why we have groups like the Doniphan Foundation and others that mainly supported by Mormons who lift him up as an example of citizenship and compassion. A second trip he made in 1876 to go down the pathway that he took in his march to Mexico. He didn't go all the way to Chihuahua, but he went most of the way and came back, and then spent basically the last 10 years of his life not practicing law, but someone who people kept coming to see. Now, most of the photographs I've showed you, except for the first one, he was clean shaven. And I don't know the symbolic, perhaps, decision there, but in the 1850s he started to grow a beard and then wore a beard the rest of his life. Now, it may just have been a trend at the time, and for a while wore a goatee. In his last years, he had a full head of hair and this long beard. Finally dying in Richmond in 1887 at the age 79. Now, part of my fascination and interest with Doniphan was what he clearly established as himself as a moderate. And you'll find again various places where he's immortalized and represented, and you will find that the word moderate shows up again and again. And as I had suggested, that for me, he is ever the moderate. Now, if you go over to the state capitol and the Hall of Fame, up on the third floor of the rotunda, you will find he's there in the Hall of Fame. And he was placed there in 2008, recognizing his position to us. I've often thought, as I've been looking more and more at the life of Doniphan, that we need that kind of hero today. Someone who is insistent upon laws, but yet compassion, insistent upon compromise, and ever insistent upon statesman-like behavior, commitment. It doesn't take too many rounds of elections in Missouri that most of us are saying, can't we have some moderation? Can't we have some conciliation? Can't we have some mutual communication? For me, Doniphan is that reminder. William Doniphan, as I begin to call Alexander the Great. Thank you.